Hey there, this is Alexis Knight. Welcome to True Crime, the Court of Public Opinion. I'm your host, guiding you through cases that have moved through the courts and reached a conclusion. They left the public divided. These aren't your typical cut and dried cases, guys. These are the ones where the facts may be clear, but the truth, well, that's another story. Here in this episode, we're going to take a step back in time to examine one of the earliest cases in American legal history that forced the courts and the public to ask a crucial question. Was it murder or was it self-defense? Before this case, the idea of killing someone just to protect yourself, it wasn't even a formal legal defense. Imagine that. It's not even an option to you, even if that's what you did. In 1837, a young servant named Nancy Ferrer stood trial for the murder of her abusive employer. What happened next laid the groundwork for how we as a society weigh the delicate balance between protecting yourself and crossing the line into murder. How many of you knew how this even started, this defense? Anybody out there? Without cases like this one, guys, the option of claiming self-defense might not even exist in our legal system today. But with that option comes great responsibility, and it raises difficult questions. Should it be up to a jury to decide whether someone acted in the heat of the moment or took it too far? Stay with me now as we explore how this case paved the way for one of the most controversial questions in the courtroom. When does self-defense become murder? By the end of this episode, you're going to see just how much this case and others like it have shaped the way we define justice today. So listen closely and decide for yourself. Should Nancy have been acquitted? Or did she cross a line that should never have been crossed? Nancy's case in 1837, it wasn't just about that single act of violence. It was about something far more complicated, the right to protect yourself in a world where that idea wasn't yet clearly defined. At just 19 years old, Nancy was a servant in Ohio, working for a man named Daniel Benton. Benton was known for his abusive behavior, and Nancy had suffered under his mistreatment for a long time. In an era when women had very few rights and even fewer options, her situation was grim. But one day, things escalated. Nancy claimed that on that fateful day, Benton had become more aggressive than ever. She feared for her life. In a moment of panic, she grabbed a kitchen tool, something as simple as a wooden rolling pin, and struck him. Benton died from the blow, and Nancy was charged with murder. Here's where the story gets interesting. Nancy did not deny hitting Benton. The facts were very clear. She struck him and he died. But the question wasn't about what she did, it was about why she did it. Was she defending herself from a life-threatening situation? Or had she taken things too far? At the time, self-defense was not recognized the way that we recognize it today. The courts and the public, they were split. Should a person have the right to kill in order to protect themselves? This was a new idea. What about after enduring prolonged abuse? Or was it just murder at the end of the day? Plain and simple, and that's it. The jury in Nancy's trial had to answer these difficult questions that were being asked, and their decision would set a precedent. If they ruled in her favor, it would mean that people did have the right to protect themselves from harm, even if it meant taking a life. But if they convicted her, it would send a message that no matter the circumstances, killing is never justified. This case sparked heated debates across the country. People began to question the balance between morality and survival. Should someone have to wait until their life is hanging by a thread to act? Or is there a point when enough is enough? These were the questions that had not been asked in the courtrooms before, but the outcome of this case would change that forever. As Nancy's case progressed, it became clear that this was about more than just a woman's desperate act. It was about how society would define self-defense and who would be allowed to claim it. In the 1830s, especially for women and servants, the idea of having the legal right to protect yourself from harm was almost unheard of. For many people, the very notion that a woman could kill her abuser and then walk free was shocking. The media of the time picked up on this and they ran with it, fueling public debate. Newspapers portrayed Nancy in varying lights. Some saw her as a victim of relentless abuse, while others painted her as a cold-blooded murderer. This case forced people to confront a harsh reality. If someone in Nancy's position was not allowed to defend herself, what hope did anyone else have? The fear wasn't just about this one instance, it was about setting a precedent that would affect countless others in the future. Before this case, the courts often viewed violent acts as criminal, right? Regardless of the circumstances. But here, for the very first time, the idea of context, the abuse Nancy suffered, the threat she felt, was brought to the forefront. And the jury had to decide, could someone be justified in taking a life if it meant saving their own? The public was deeply divided. On one hand, you had those who believed that no one should have the power to kill another human being, no matter the reason. On the other hand, there were those who argued that people like Nancy, trapped in abusive situations with no way out, needed the law to protect when the world around them would not. This wasn't just about a legal theory. This was about real lives, real fear, and real survival. Why is this case so important? Why are we talking about it today? Because it opened the door for self-defense to even be considered a valid legal defense in the first place. Without Nancy's case, the notion that you could protect yourself even at the cost of another person's life might not ever have been formally recognized. Today, when we hear about cases of self-defense, we forget that there was a time when the law did not account for the fear and desperation that often lead to such actions. This case also marked one of the first times that the media played a critical role in shaping public opinion. Newspapers were the social media of the 1830s. Hard to imagine, but just like today, everyone wanted more information and they went to the source to get it. That's what we're doing today, just a different way, more available. But they had the newspapers and they were everywhere, and they fanned the flames of this debate. Some articles supported Nancy, highlighting the years of abuse she had to endure, while others condemned her actions as nothing more than murder. The way the media portrayed the case influenced how people viewed self-defense, pushing the legal system to take a closer look at the complexities of such situations. In many ways, this case was more than just one woman's fate. This was about creating a framework for understanding how the law should protect anyone who finds themselves in life-threatening situations. The jury was not just deciding Nancy's future, right? They were setting a precedent that would resonate for generations to come. We know about this defense today, and we take for granted that it's here. Imagine for a moment, though, if this case had gone the other way. If the jury had convicted Nancy, it would have sent a message that self-defense was not a legitimate defense, no matter how dire the circumstances. And think about how that would have shaped future cases. How many people might have been imprisoned or even executed for protecting themselves in a life-threatening situation? This is why it is so important to understand the weight of this case. The outcome shaped not just one life, but the course of legal history. Okay, let's look at the facts of what went down way back then. Nancy's story begins in the small town of Urbana, Ohio. In the early 1800s, at the age of 19, she found herself working as a servant for Daniel Benton, like I said, a man known for his volatile temper and abusive nature. In that era, servants had very few rights, and abuse, while not acceptable, was often overlooked or swept under the rug. Nancy was trapped in a life where she had little autonomy and even fewer options for escape. Over the months leading up to the fatal incident, witnesses recalled hearing Benton yell at and physically intimidate Nancy. Neighbors knew about the situation, but as was common at that time, they did little to intervene. At that time, you just didn't get involved in anyone else's issues, and now we just get involved in everything. Very different back then. Society then had a stark divide between the privileged and the working class, and women, especially servants, had very little voice or agency in defending themselves. Again, very, very different today. On the day of this incident, it began like many others with Nancy tending to household chores. Benton, agitated and irritable, escalated his usual verbal abuse into a physical confrontation. According to Nancy's account, Benton became particularly violent, threatening her life. In a panic, Nancy grabbed a kitchen tool, a wooden rolling pin, and struck Benton in self-defense, and this blow was fatal. Now, at first glance, the case seemed straightforward. Nancy had killed Benton. There was no dispute that she struck the blow. The challenge came in proving whether this was an act of self-defense or something more sinister. The facts of the case centered around two critical issues: the history of Benton's abuse and whether Nancy truly believed that her life was in danger when she acted. The trial that followed was unprecedented in many ways. At the time, the legal system didn't recognize self-defense the way it does today, as we know. And the idea of a woman, especially a servant, defending herself against a man was almost unthinkable. However, Nancy's defense team took the bold step of arguing that she had acted in self-defense, setting the stage for a case that would challenge long-held society norms. As the trial unfolded, the courtroom was packed. Journalists reported on every development, and public interest in the case grew. The facts of Nancy's life and the abuse she endured became a central piece of her defense. The question was no longer whether she had killed Benton. The real question was why. The trial progressed. More details about Nancy's life and Benton's abuse came to light. Witnesses were called to testify about the brutal conditions Nancy endured. It wasn't just a matter of one bad day. Benton had been abusive for months, maybe even years. Neighbors and former employees described hearing Benton shouting at Nancy regularly, with some even claiming to have seen physical marks of abuse on her. Yet, for all this evidence, the law at the time provided very little protection for someone like Nancy. She's a servant, she's a woman. In the eyes of many, her rights as an individual were secondary to the property rights and authority of her employer. The prosecution, however, they were determined to prove that Nancy had acted out of anger, maybe revenge, not fear. They pointed to the fact that Benton had been struck from behind, suggesting she wasn't facing an immediate threat when she hit him. And they argued that if she had truly been in fear for her life, she could have fled the house instead of resorting to violence. This line of questioning placed a heavy burden on Nancy and her defense team. They had to prove that in that moment, she believed there was no other way out. The defense focused on the idea that Nancy had been pushed to her breaking point. She had nowhere to go, no one to turn to, and in her mind, striking Benton was the only way to save herself. At the time, there were no shelters, there are no social services for abused women. And even if she had tried to leave, her prospects as a young, unmarried servant, they were pretty bleak. It's not like today. The defense emphasized that her actions were not premeditated. They were desperate. It was a response to a situation that had escalated beyond her control. The media attention surrounding the case also added a layer of complexity. Newspapers, of course, sensationalized the trial, even way back then, drawing in readers with headlines about a murderous maid or an abused servant and her pleas for justice. Even back then, the media was learning that if they make it interesting sounding enough, the viewers will come and more money they will make. The media is powerful. They can push the public in one direction or another, and the public, they just take it. And back then, the media was realizing this. So this was something to know about this case, because the media could have pushed public opinion and everything else in a whole different direction. And then how would have things looked? And why would they have had control over that? That's how it is. And how it was back then. And for this case, they did portray a divided public opinion. Some saw her as a victim, some saw her as a cold-blooded killer. The trial became a reflection of the broader social tensions at that time, where class and gender and power dynamics all played a role in how justice was perceived. And I know we face those issues today, but back then things were they were a lot more simple. And so you really were dealing with these things. And so they stood out in maybe a bigger way. It was just one thing or the other thing, not so much of the in-between that we have now. For this, as the trial continued, Nancy's defense team, they carefully laid out their case. They focused on the cumulative effect of Benton's abuse, and they were trying to make it clear that this wasn't a case of sudden rage or vengeance. This was truly about survival. They argued that Nancy had been living under the constant threat of violence for so long that on that fateful day, she genuinely believed that her time was up and her life was in danger, that this was going to be the day, that this was not a momentary lapse in judgment, but rather the result of prolonged, inescapable trauma. Key to Nancy's defense was the testimony of medical experts, who even back then were explaining the psychological effects of ongoing abuse, something the public and people in general just have a hard time accepting. While terms like battered woman syndrome didn't exist back in the 1830s, the defense effectively illustrated how constant fear can warp someone's perception of danger. And they argued that even if Benton hadn't been about to strike her at that very moment, Nancy's fear was real and justified based on everything she had endured. And let me challenge you with this. As the person that had gone through all of this abuse, wouldn't they be the most qualified, maybe, using that word very loosely, to determine when that day might be here? It's a personal perception and a personal situation based on what has been done to you. And so every time that Benton's doing this, she's gauging, it's getting worse, next time he could kill me. Like, these kinds of things are going through the victim's head. But the prosecution, they weren't buying that whole idea. They focused on the idea of proportionality. Okay, was Nancy's response truly proportionate to the threat she was facing? The fact that Benton had been struck from behind suggested in their view that Nancy was not in immediate danger when she hit him. They painted a picture of someone who had planned the attack in a moment of cold calculation, possibly after a minor argument. Their strategy was to undermine the idea that Nancy acted in the heat of the moment, suggesting instead that she had intended to kill Benton the entire time. To complicate matters, the prosecution also emphasized that Nancy had not immediately reported this incident to authorities. Instead, it was Benton's body that alerted the neighbors that something was wrong. In the eyes of the prosecution, her failure to call for help suggested guilt, not fear. And this was a pivotal point in this case because it challenged the narrative that Nancy acted purely in self-defense. I mean, why wouldn't she have sought help if her actions were truly justified? The defense responded to that, and they argued that Nancy's failure to report the incident was yet another reflection of her fear. As a young servant with no real power, she had spent years believing that no one would help her. Even after Benton's death, the weight of her circumstances left her paralyzed. She was unsure of what to do next. This explanation resonated with many in the courtroom, particularly those who saw Nancy as a tragic figure caught in an impossible situation. As the courtroom drama unfolded, the question of Nancy's intent became a central focus. The jury was not only weighing the facts, but also the larger societal issues at play. Nancy's case was not just one about a woman's actions. This was about how society would treat victims of abuse and whether the law would recognize the complexity of situations like this. Was it possible for someone to reach a point where taking a life could be justified because they didn't have any other choices? One of the defense's strongest points was the lack of options, lack of choices available to Nancy at that time. The concept of self-defense was narrowly defined. For many people, especially women in servitude, the legal system offered no refuge. There was no help to them. Nancy could not have gone to the authorities. There were no domestic violence protections in place. Her word against a man's would likely have been dismissed. And we all know that, don't we, today? We have to know that. Her actions, the defense argued, were the result of a system that had failed her. She had been pushed to the brink. She had no one to turn to, nowhere to go, no legal recourse to escape Benton's abuse. What else could she have done in a moment where she thought he was going to kill her? And imagine if that were happening today, that if someone was attacking you and you were a woman and this was a man and you knew that you could do nothing about it. That would add to the fear monumentally. That's a big deal. But now, on the other hand, the prosecution, they were continuing to hammer away at the idea that Nancy did have alternatives. They pointed out that she had survived Benton's abuse for months. Well, she didn't experience any violence in those times. They argued that if she had truly feared for her life, she could have fled or found a way to de-escalate. The fact that she chose to strike Benton instead, though, with such force, they said that's evidence that she had crossed the line into flat-out murder. As the trial neared its conclusion, the weight of the jury's decision became increasingly clear. This was not just about determining Nancy's guilt or innocence. This was about setting a legal precedent that would influence future cases of self-defense. For the first time, the legal system was being asked to consider not only the immediate threat of violence, but also the broader context of ongoing abuse. This was a pivotal shift in how self-defense cases would be handled, especially for individuals who had been systematically victimized. The closing arguments from both sides underscored the stakes. The prosecution urged the jury to focus on the act itself. Nancy had taken a life. The defense, however, they implored the jury to consider the bigger picture. She wasn't just a servant who killed her employer. She was a victim of relentless abuse, and she had reached her breaking point. After weeks of testimony and emotional arguments, the jury was left to make a decision that would shape the future of self-defense law. The courtroom was tense as the verdict was read. Nancy was acquitted of murder, a decision that sent shockwaves through the community and the legal system. Her acquittal marked a turning point, establishing that self-defense could be a legitimate defense in cases where prolonged abuse played a significant role. Nancy's case did not just change her life, it changed the course of legal history. For Nancy, however, the verdict was bittersweet. Although she was acquitted, her life would never be the same, because now she had become a symbol of both hope and controversy, representing the complexities of justice in cases where the lines between victim and aggressor aren't so clear. Her case would be cited for decades to come as lawyers and judges grappled with the legal and moral questions it raised. The acquittal of Nancy sparked widespread controversy, both in the courtroom and beyond. While the legal system had made its decision, the public was far from unanimous in its response. they were still on two sides. One of the most heated points of the debate was whether Nancy's actions truly constituted self-defense. And the courts, and the media, and the public all had a mix of opinions. The controversy surrounding this case, it didn't end with this verdict. In the years that followed, legal scholars, public figures, they continued to debate whether the jury had made the right decision on that day. Was Nancy a tragic victim who had finally fought back, or was she a murderer? They still could not decide. Now, the legal implications of this case rippled through the courts for years. Legal scholars and judges, they struggled with the questions of where to draw the line between justified self-defense and criminal action. While Nancy's acquittal was groundbreaking, it left a gray area in the law. How much abuse must a person endure before their actions can be seen as self-defense? And at what point does self-defense become murder? These questions were particularly important in cases that followed. As Nancy's trial became a precedent for other legal claims of defense, particularly those involving domestic abuse, judges began to refer back to her case when dealing with defendants who argued that their actions were a result of some kind of long-term mistreatment. Not every court agreed with the outcome of Nancy's trial. In some cases, defendants who found themselves in similar situations, they were still convicted, despite using the same defense. And that part of this is still happening today, because we can't prove what happened in someone else's head. Did they really perceive a threat to their life in that moment? As the years passed, the debate surrounding Nancy's case continued to simmer, because this was not just about legal principles. It wasn't about the verdict. It became a touch point for broader cultural discussions about justice overall, morality, and the role of the courts. This case also highlighted the growing influence of the media on legal proceedings, and that we for sure see today. It's almost as if they got that opportunity back then, and they saw how many people could be interested in what they have to say, and they just took it, and they're still doing it today, even if they're not giving facts. What is the definition of news? Okay, well, they talk a lot, and people are listening, and it is affecting opinions still today. The sensationalized coverage of Nancy's trial, it stirred public opinion in ways that they had not seen before. This was new. The newspapers of the day, they were filled with editorials, debates, and heated letters from the readers, all of whom had strong opinions. In the end, Nancy's case became a landmark in legal history. And not just because of the verdict, this was because of the conversation that it started. And it remains still today a reminder of those lines between right and wrong, self-defense and murder. Those lines are often blurred. And while the courts may have rendered their decision, the court of public opinion continues to debate whether her actions were justified to this day. All right, well, now that we've walked through the facts, the arguments, and the controversy, it is time for you to ask yourself what you think. Was Nancy justified in her actions? Did she cross a line? The court made its ruling back in 1837, but the debate around this case has never truly ended. So I leave it with you. Was justice served? Did the system fail? Should someone in Nancy's position be allowed to walk free after taking a life? Or does that open a door to justifying violence under circumstances that may not always be clear-cut? That's the hardest part of this question. And as you consider this case, think about the broader implications. It's not just about one person. This is about how we as a whole define justice. Is it more important to protect those who are vulnerable, even if that means excusing violence? Or is it crucial to maintain strict limits on when self-defense can be used as a defense, ensuring that the legal system does not become a tool for people to escape responsibility, because that becomes a problem. We don't know all the way if someone lies about this, because again, we can't be in their head, and that is the biggest problem about this. At the end of the day, the courts made their ruling. Nancy walked free, and her case became a landmark in legal history. But for each of us, the question remains, would you have made the same decision? You've heard the details, and now the choice is yours. What decision will you make? Thank you for joining me on another deep dive into the world of real-life crime and courtroom drama. Stay safe out there, guys. Stay out of trouble. And until next time, this is Alexis Knight signing off from True Crime, the Court of Public Opinion. Talk to you soon.